So today we're going to talk about Autism 101 Part 2. So how we can support students who are on the autism spectrum. So I want to first introduce myself. My name is Sarah Martin. I'm currently a PhD student in the special education program at The Ohio State University. Formerly, I was a special education teacher working with students with moderate to intensive disabilities, so plenty of students with autism. I did that for about 6 years before leaving the classroom to obtain my PhD. If you have any questions or need anything from me following the presentation, this is my name.number, so martin.4388. You can email me at martin.4388@osu.edu. I will also provide that email at the end of the presentation, so if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? So first, we're going to go through a brief overview of what is autism. In my previous presentation, we talked a lot about the characteristics of autism, so this will just kind of be a brief overview. We're going to talk about some school environment challenges that are presented to students with autism. And then we're going to go through some practical strategies and suggestions to address some of those challenges. And then at the very end, if we have time, we'll go ahead and apply what we've learned. So first, what is autism? So autism is a developmental disorder that impacts the way individuals communicate and interpret their environment, often resulting in challenges with social interactions and processing information. Although in this session, let me move my thing over a little. Although in this session, we will talk about supports that are specific to the needs of students on the autism spectrum, you will find that many of the support strategies will help any individual student. So more specifically, I want to go through the definition of autism spectrum disorder in the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, so the DSM-5. And this is the criteria that many psychologists and psychiatrists will use when evaluating individuals for autism. So that involves persistent deficits in social communication. Oh, sorry about that. I accidentally went to the wrong slide. So that involves persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across contexts, restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. Symptoms must present in early childhood, and these symptoms must cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. So when a psychiatrist evaluates an individual, they are looking for these things in order to diagnose them with autism spectrum disorder. So here, I just like to show this slide because we know that people with autism have been our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, our students throughout the years. There's also lots of speculation about whether or not some famous people had ASD. And we often see these people with autism portrayed in the medium as having either autism, Asperger's syndrome, or ASD. These have been used to describe people who have some of the characteristics and behaviors we will be talking about today. So these are just some examples of people who you may be familiar with who have or have been speculated to have autism spectrum disorder. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and move on to this video that goes over what it's like being autistic. And I'm actually going to show this on YouTube.
Hi, Sarah, we might need your volume.
Oh. And I'm not sure. I think
Yep, share sound.
Okay. Let's see. Can you hear it now?
7, 8, 9. Take my hand. I'm not naughty. I'm autistic. And I just get too much information.
Okay. So although this video takes place in a mall, I like to show this because I feel like it gives a good representation of what it's like to be autism in a school setting every day. I know when I was a teacher and I taught at a middle school and a high school, sometimes navigating those hallways was pretty intimidating. And there was lots of different things going on. So I think that kind of gives us a good representation of what it would be like being autistic and having to be in a school environment for the majority of your day.
That's weird.
So school environment challenges. So school environments can be challenging for students on the autism spectrum. So they can be challenging for several reasons. One is transitions. So to transition throughout the school day, it requires multiple changes. Some of these can be predictable changes, but some of these can also be unpredictable. Things like fire drills, any kind of thing that can come up throughout the day, which can be challenging for students on the autism spectrum. Also, kind of like we saw in this video, school environments have lots of different sights and sounds. So noise and commotion can be very overwhelming for the individual. Also bright lights and lots of different things around in the hallway. So things hanging on the walls, lots of different visual stimuli can also be very overwhelming for a student on the autism spectrum. So because of these things, students on the autism spectrum often have difficulty understanding what they are supposed to do and picking out the important information from the environment that they are supposed to benefit from. So even when teachers and schools devote their efforts to providing structure and predictability, these things are part of everyday life for the student. And some of this can be alleviated by having a clear agenda and making that accessible to students. So if there's going to be like changes or transitions, making sure students are aware of that. However, like we said, like there's no amount of planning that can help to prepare against things that sudden changes that disrupt the routine. So similar to like a fire drill or an early dismissal. We know we live in Ohio, so those can be kind of common due to weather. And we should make sure if we do have these available, we have necessary supports in place, or that we are aware of these things. We have necessary supports in place to help the student through those unexpected changes. And because of all of these things, by the time students with on the autism spectrum get to the classroom or in the classroom, there's a good chance they're very stressed, unsettled, and preoccupied with how they're figuring out what to do. And they are trying to pick out that important information, but this can also be very difficult to them. So now I'm going to give everyone a few minutes to think about your classrooms, hallways, assemblies, expectations, and so on that are in place in your school. And I want you to think about what are the aspects of these places, these environments that may make it a challenging environment for the student on the autism spectrum. I want you to write down or think of at least 5 examples, and I'm going to give everybody a couple minutes.
Right. Somebody. Hello?
Say something, please.
All right, we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide, but excuse me, if you were still thinking of some examples, you can go ahead and write these down, or if more come up throughout the presentation, feel free to write those down or remember those for later on in the presentation. So structure is key to supporting most students, but especially those on the autism spectrum. Teaching students on the autism spectrum requires a supportive learning environment. And this begins with making the information accessible and explicit for them. To provide adequate supports for students, you have to understand their perspective. Think of your classroom as another country with a different culture. The student on the autism spectrum disorder is a tourist in that country. So think about a time that you've ever been a tourist in a different country. That can be a pretty challenging experience. Your job is to help the student navigate and understand what is important to pay attention to. A well-structured and predictable classroom can provide comfort for students on the autism spectrum and help them and their peers better attend to the learning. So again, making sure information is accessible, priming and preparing students for activities and changes, creating a predictable classroom, and making expectations clear can all help students on the autism spectrum. So this video clip that we're about to watch shows a teacher laying out expectations for all her students using specific classroom supports. After the video, I want you to think about throughout the video, I want you to think about what are some of the instructional supports that you noticed. I'm actually going to start a new share. Let me go ahead and open the video first. So it's a little bigger.
Your teacher. Mrs. Redfern is going to.
Okay.
Mrs. Redfern is going to come at the end of the class because you're going to be doing research.
For students with autism, structure in the classroom is critical.
Most individuals with autism get extremely anxious and non-productive in chaotic environments. They are much more organized themselves when they're in organized environments and when task expectations are clear and can be laid out in front of them visually.
When you walk in my classroom, I provide a list of goals on the board. The homework is very clearly listed. I give an opportunity for students to see that. I talk a little bit about that. I talk about the homework.
All right. So there were several supports she had in the classroom. Does anyone want to go ahead and share in the chat what are some of those things that she had that would support students with autism in the classroom? Yes, she had a clear agenda. She had that sign posted with what will be happening, those visual expectations, a visual schedule. Yes, those are things we're going to go through in more detail later. Prepared for the teacher coming at the end of the class. That's important. New adults coming in, or when the absence of an adult can be intimidating and overwhelming for a student on the spectrum. A calm voice, a routine, good. And making sure letting students know what was going on. Very good. Thank you for sharing. So those were lots of supports that can be used to help students on the spectrum within the classroom. Providing that structure, again, is key.
This is Red.
So priming. On the previous slide, we talked a little bit about priming, and I kind of wanted to go through that in more detail. So first of all, what is priming? Priming is exposure to academic course material or tasks before instruction. So like you saw, the teacher was kind of going through what they were expecting for the day. That would be an example of priming. It's kind of like a fancy word for preparing. Why should we use this strategy? Priming gives students the chance to become familiar with the material or skills and increases the likelihood they will learn and use the key concepts. Through priming, we are familiarizing our students with concepts in order to help them be successful. Through priming, we can help to pre-teach what they're going to learn in the classroom and decrease their anxiety about that new material. Priming always works best when it's part of the routine in the classroom or when it's built into the daily routine. Consider how to build in priming for particular students or for your whole class. Like, for example, after a lesson, you might want to briefly introduce the big ideas of the next lesson and how they're connected to what was just taught. Also, you might want to consider how you might use other sources of support, including the student's parents or other individuals in the classroom, to use priming when you are about to present something new to that student. So for example, sometimes like what I would do in the classroom is I would send home with my student what is going to be expected for the week. So talking with your teachers and kind of getting a plan in place so that they can send this home with parents. And then parents can help to prime the students and remind them of what to expect for the coming week. So especially with things like if there's a large assembly happening soon, you might want to prime a student who struggles with loud noises by saying, let's remember what you can do if it becomes too loud. Some things we've talked about are putting on your headphones or sitting close to the exit so you can walk into the hallway if you need to. And then asking them if there's anything else that they can do. So just making sure you're preparing that student for anything that's expected or unexpected that may come up throughout their days. So this next video clip is going to go through a little bit of what priming looks like. So let me go ahead and pull this one up and then share that so that it's bigger for you. 1 second.
Your teacher gave me
All right.
the master copy and your notes sheet so that you can fill it out beforehand, and then she's going to call on you for the first one.
Priming students means exposing him or her to course material before a lesson takes place. It gives students a chance to become familiar with the material and increases the likelihood they'll learn key concepts and details.
The teacher who stands in front of her chemistry class and says, first, we're going to read Chapter 7, pages 19 to 25. Then I'm going to tell you what is important in those pages, and then you're going to do an experiment. Okay, that's priming.
What? Atoms? Exactly, atoms.
Priming is the most effective when it's written into the student's daily routine, and teachers can work with parents to help reinforce this strategy at home.
What happens if you don't like the food?
I just don't spit it out.
Thank you. What do you do?
Just leave it aside.
Okay, good. And what?
I would prime him about a week before he had something due. If he had a test on Friday, the teacher made sure I knew about it on Monday. If there's a big assignment, I had to prime him for about 2 months, because out of sight, out of mind, if you do a little bit of the work 1 week and you wait 2 weeks, he forgets about the assignment.
All right. So with priming, a lot of this requires being in communication with the classroom teacher so that you are prepared for what is happening so that you can better prepare the student for what is happening. So like you saw at the beginning of the video, that professional was had talked with the teacher and had found out, excuse me, which part of the which part of class that the student was going to participate in and primed her for that. That helps them be prepared and kind of prevents some of the frustration and stress that can come from those unexpected changes or even just unexpected things that might pop up throughout the day.
Your teacher.
So using like a tool like this one where you have your classroom set out in a map can help teachers and the professionals in the room think of ways to make the classroom more clear for all students, especially with students on the autism spectrum. So I want you to kind of take a look at this classroom and think of things that you see that would benefit the student. And I'm going to go to the next slide real quick. So describe 2 supports that you noticed. And then think about 2 or 3 elements of a well-structured classroom that you work in, or that you would like to add to the classroom that you work in to better support your student on the autism spectrum. I'm going to give everybody about a minute.
They're worried that how.
And I like what people are sharing in this chat. So having several stations that are clearly labeled, having them spaced out appropriately is a great idea. Having sinks and first aid are available, especially because this is looks like a science classroom. I like how the sinks and the first aid are also close to the lab stations, so it's easy for kids to get to if there's an emergency. I also like in this classroom how the student desks are all facing the dry erase board as well as the teacher desk, and they are close to the teacher desk, so they have easy access for support if needed. Some of the things specific to students, the spacing I think is great too. Some of the things that are specific to students on the autism spectrum, if you notice that the student desks are facing away from the computer station, so those bright lights won't affect them that typically come from a computer. Also, the equipment station that may have chemicals that are a little bit off-putting to some students with the smells and things like that are far away from their students so that they don't distract them during their seat work. So again, just having this map in place is a good idea. Having it available for your student to even see and having things clearly labeled, I think are all things that help the student and things that you can help. I know teachers are very busy throughout the day. So having these things, making labels for the classroom are a simple task that could really help to benefit the students on the autism spectrum. Okay. So again, lots of people were sharing in the chat some of the supports they noticed and some things of just a general well-structured classroom that they work in. Or maybe some of these things are things you would like to add or help to support in the classroom that you work in or setting that you work in. Okay, so now we're going to go through some brief examples of some supports and accommodations that can be used to help students on the autism spectrum. So some of these school-based supports and accommodations that can be used throughout the entire school could be giving directions using brief language, so being very short and specific with your directions, being specific and direct in your instruction. So making sure that when you are working with the student or you're teaching them something that you are very specific and direct. Offering them choices is key. A lot of times with students on the autism spectrum, if they are given a choice, they feel like they have a little bit more control over the situation. That kind of goes along with being flexible with expectations. So when you're offering choice, you're already kind of being flexible with what you expect them to do, but also just being flexible with your expectations is key. Help them with processing events throughout the day. So especially those things like a fire drill or those unexpected events that come up throughout the day. Make sure you're setting aside time to process these events with the student. Or if there's anything that you know that's coming up at home or that's affecting them throughout the day, setting aside time to talk with the student about these things is very important. It shows that you care and allows them to kind of process those events. Otherwise, they're really bottling those things up inside, which just leads to frustration and them feeling very uncomfortable throughout the school day. Providing pragmatic language coaching and support. So working with students on how to use appropriate voice volume and things like that so that they can be clearly understood, and also kind of going through what's expected in the classroom and supporting them through that can be helpful. Using modeling of how they should be talking in the classroom is very helpful as well. And then using those visual and verbal cues together. I'm trying to keep up with the chat as much as possible. And I notice a lot of people talking about nonverbal students. So those visual cues would be key. But you always want to pair those with a verbal as well. So making sure you're pairing or using visual and verbal cues together.
We had some really good, just playing off what you said. Christina stated that one of her students uses a clear schedule, but it has, there's a Velcro schedule that she can swap out the different activities for different days. So that is an option as well.
Definitely. That is awesome. And a little bit, I'll go into more detail about visual supports, and I kind of show some examples of visual schedules, but I definitely love the ones with Velcro because that gives lots of different options. And it allows students to move things around. So thank you for sharing. That's a great accommodation. So some sample learning accommodations that can be helpful is the use of social stories. So for instance, in my classroom, we had a student who did not like animals, and we had a visit to the zoo coming up. So one of my paraprofessionals kind of wrote a little social story about our day at the zoo, and some included things like, what can you expect? What are you going to see? What are some of the sights and sounds that will come up throughout the day? Those can be super beneficial for students. Also providing them with like editing or multi-step checklists. So if you're given an activity from the teacher, kind of breaking that down into steps, or if they need to edit their work, clearly stating what they need to, like a checklist of what they need to do, and having them check that off as they go along is super helpful. Making sure activities and class periods are structured. So making sure there's not a lot of time for them just to kind of sit around. So if like the teacher is busy preparing things, having other things there to help the student throughout those times is very beneficial. Again, that being flexible. So being flexible with expectations around time and the activity. So a lot of times our students on the autism spectrum need that extra time. They may even need that extra time to process directions and to get started. So making sure you're flexible and just providing wait time for those students is key. Making sure you're providing and facilitating access to like a sensory diet and breaks. So there's a lot of students who need some of that sensory input. So making sure that they have access to those things. So a fidget, or something that provides them with pressure, any of those kind of things throughout to help them navigate throughout their days. Making sure to provide non-judgmental cueing and redirection when needed. So using that positive tone of voice and not being judgmental when you are redirecting the student. One of my favorite was noise canceling headphones. I felt like my classroom, I only had 8 students, but we had 16 pairs of noise canceling headphones just in case. You never know what's going to happen to them. So having those prepared, a lot of my students, luckily we were able to sometimes prepare them for some of those expected fire drills. But for a lot of my students, we kept these like right on their desks or hanging next to the desks or in their desks so that they had them ready to go if there was a loud noise. We also, like if there was a paraprofessional working right next to that student, they had them, because sometimes if they could hear the noise quickly, they could get them on the student as well. So having those available is key. Sometimes the classroom and the lunch, especially the cafeteria, can be very overwhelming for students on the autism spectrum. So again, providing them with that choice to eat lunch or work in a quieter area. Sometimes it's really important to have students on the autism spectrum eating lunch with their peers, but maybe just having like an area of the cafeteria that is away from the other students and away from a lot of the noise can be helpful. And another thing is incorporating their special interests that are motivating to them. So if you're working on like a math assignment, you can incorporate some of those like things that they like. So if they like superheroes, involve superheroes in the math problems. Kind of manipulating and changing those questions so that it involves the things that are motivating to them can also be super helpful. Some sample or schedule accommodations can involve providing a predictable and consistent schedule throughout their day. So providing a visible daily schedule, so on the wall or on their desk, wherever is most convenient for them. So like we said, with the someone mentioned with the Velcro schedule, having that available on their desk throughout the day and having that set ahead of time is key. Providing advanced knowledge of a transition or change. So like we showed in the video, it had them kind of notifying parents of things to expect the week ahead of time. That way parents can help prime over the weekend. If you know there's going to be an assembly on Friday, if you know there's going to be a late arrival on Thursday, making sure that at the beginning of the week, you were letting that student know that. Obviously, things are going to be unpredictable and come up, but trying your best to provide advanced knowledge is very helpful. Make sure on the schedule that you are reflecting any real-time changes. So like we said, things come up. That's why those visuals or those Velcro schedules can be very beneficial, because you can kind of change things in real time. So moving things around and making sure you're reflecting those changes and talking through those changes with the student. Sometimes just putting that on their schedule and letting them know, hey, there was a change, but look, we've added it to your schedule, can really make them feel better about that change. And then making sure that you're providing reminders and cues to assist with the change or transition. So not only putting it on their schedule, but reminding them and cueing them to kind of help them move through that change or transition can be very beneficial. So now we're going to talk in a little more detail about visual support. So another key support for students on the spectrum is the use of visuals to help clarify information and promote comprehension. So students on the autism spectrum tend to be visual learners, and visuals can come in many forms and should be developed based on the student's needs and preferences. So on this slide, we're going to talk about what are visual supports and go through some examples. As we are going through these, you can go ahead and share in the chat some of the visuals that you may use with your specific student. So again, visual supports are any tool presented visually that supports an individual as he or she moves throughout the day. Some examples are pictures, written words, objects within the environment, visual boundaries, schedules, maps, labels, organization systems, timelines, and scripts. So yes, I see in the chat someone has shared pictures. Those are very helpful. Someone said we use all of these. That is awesome. One of my favorites is kind of the visual boundaries. I worked in a middle school, so a lot of times transitioning from elementary to middle school, some of those boundaries, personal space things are new aspects to those students. So having kind of visual boundaries, we would just kind of use tape on the floor. So maybe tape in that student's favorite color and make kind of a box to say, this is your space. This is where we need you to be today. Sensory toys in a small box, using pictures and schedules, labeling things. I have students that love my calendar that shows when they don't have school. Yes, but a calendar is really important too, because that can kind of provide them with a snapshot of what's going to be happening in their future. So like a monthly calendar is good, a weekly calendar, having videos. Good. These are all great examples. On the next slide, I go through some more specific examples. So feel free to keep sharing any examples of visual supports that you use. So some specific examples can be a map of the school outlining the students' classes. So especially for those students who are in middle school, who are in high school that may be transitioning to different classes. Also just for a student in elementary school who may need to go to the gym or the art room, having a map so that they know where they're going can be very helpful. Having a list of classes, room numbers, books, and other supplies that they need. So again, some of those middle and high school students who may need to bring things throughout their day, or really just any student who may need to be going to different room numbers in classrooms and bringing different things with them, having a visual available so that they know what to expect and what to bring with them can be helpful. Having a list of the expectations and routines available in each classroom can be helpful. Having a schedule of activities within a class, so like that Velcro visual schedule, so that typically can be used, that you could use a Velcro visual schedule to show each day. A lot of my students had a visual schedule that showed their whole day with their classes listed, but then we also had one that was Velcro that had like the different activities within the class. So teacher instruction, independent work time, worksheet, whatever works for your student or whatever they would understand, having those available is very helpful. Having a sample model of the assignment, so if the teacher can provide you with what they're going to be working on that week, kind of coming up with a model of what is expected for that assignment can be very helpful. Having a list of test or work reminders. Sometimes with students on the autism spectrum, it's really hard for them to keep track of like homework or their assignments. So having this available for them can be very helpful. And then having a list of like any schedule changes that may come up throughout the day can be very helpful. So thank you again for all of the sharing in the chat.
Yeah, they're really, really good feedback in the chat. Mary Winkler said sign language used along with verbal instruction for her S&P kiddos. So that's a really good one as well.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing. Yes, lots of different visual supports can be incorporated throughout the day to really benefit all students, not just students on the autism spectrum. So thank you for sharing. So visual supports can also take the form of self-management tools, graphic organizers, and social supports. So these tools generally outline the steps needed to complete a task. So this is for the self-management piece. They help students stay focused and understand the behavior. So they outline the steps needed to complete a task, and the students can check off each step as it's completed. If a student has difficulty with mastering a routine or understanding what it is about their behavior that isn't working, the teacher can also make a short video that they watch that can help them kind of self-manage that behavior. So graphic organizers help the student highlight important information. They present material in a way that makes it easier for students to understand. And they not only highlight important information and facts, but they also illustrate the relationship between them. And finally, with social scripts help the student understand what to say or how to act in particular situations. These can be used to help students better understand their behavior and its impacts on others. So a teacher can write the social scripts and you can use them with the student, and you can have them on note cards. You can have them in a little notebook that they can use. And a lot of times it just includes things like appropriate responses or initiations, but these really vary depending on what the student needs. So let's go ahead and look at some examples of each of these. So here are some examples of self-management tools. So in the picture on the left is a list of expectations of a good story. The student would then assess their work by checking off the elements of quality that they feel they have met. And then this would be an example of a student managing their own learning. So they're kind of taking responsibility for their own learning. So kind of a more simple one, and I definitely use something like this in my classroom. On the right, the student has a Post-it note that's not very obtrusive. It just sits on the side of their desk. This student in particular is working on asking less questions during the class period. So the student can then mark off when he's asked a question. So you can pick, do you want him to have 5 opportunities, 10 opportunities? This one is showing an example of 10 opportunities. So 10 different circles to ask a question. This is another example of a student who is managing their own behavior. Having things like this available can also be very helpful if you kind of create these and you provide them to the teacher. It can help the teacher with collecting data on the behavior. So you're also helping the teacher as well. So here's some examples of graphic organizers. I know a lot of times in the classroom when I would present material to my students, a lot of times my paraprofessionals would kind of help to break these things down into a graphic organizer. So this one shows 2 different examples. So on the left, we have a simple graphic organizer for breaking down what's in a paragraph. So this can be very helpful for a student when they're reading a paragraph to kind of break down what they are reading so that they can better comprehend that. And on the right is an organizer for taking notes during class. A lot of times students on the spectrum really struggle with taking notes and then also kind of understanding what they're supposed to get out of these notes. So this will help them also review the notes and expand on their understanding. Again, these are supports that really all students can benefit from using, but they're definitely particularly helpful for students on the autism spectrum. So those are just 2 examples, but graphic organizers can take many different forms. And again, remember that visuals can be helpful to all of us. When you're eating at a restaurant, most of us can only remember the meals available to us when we see them on the menu. than if they were set aloud by a server. So that's why most restaurants you go to will have a menu so that you can visually look at what you want to order. And then people on the autism spectrum are particularly likely to benefit from these visual supports. So the frequent use of visual supports are key. Like in the previous slide, we said pairing those verbals with a visual is definitely helpful for students. So this is going to be a video. I'm trying to see how much time we have left. If we have time, I'll come back to this because based on the chat, it sounds like a lot of you are pretty familiar with a visual schedule. This video just kind of goes through how, this is actually in a home, but it goes through how a parent uses a visual schedule throughout a child's day in their home. So if we have time, we can come back to this video.
We've got about 10 minutes or so before the next lunch break.
Cool. All right. So I want us to think back to the beginning of this presentation. So think back to some of the examples you wrote down about the aspects of your school or classroom environment that may make it a challenging environment for a student on the autism spectrum. And go ahead and share in the chat or just think about ways that you can support the students on the autism spectrum in your school or classroom. So applying some of these supports and strategies that we've learned throughout the day. So what are some ways that it is challenging and how can we better support students on the autism spectrum in their schools and classroom? And while you guys are working on that, I'm kind of going back through the chat and like, yes, a list assumes they can actually read. So that's why sometimes it's good. You can have a list using words or you can use pictures as well. That can be helpful for students who are struggling with reading.
I see from Deborah as well. She asked, would the graphic organizers be mostly for older students?
Yes, but I think they can be used for any student. So just depending on the classroom content, I used graphic organizers almost daily in my middle school classroom. So that would be for older students. But I think it could definitely be used for younger students as well, just depending on like, especially that reading one. In an elementary school, if they're reading something, even if it's a short story or a short paragraph, having that available so that they can kind of pull out the key details from that story. So you can really use it with any age student.
We had a comment or question earlier from Ms. Flora asking, would everyone be able to get a copy of the presentation potentially?
Yes, I can share this. I'll share this with you and Nicole, if that's okay. And
yeah,
then you
that'll
can
be
go ahead
great.
and share with everybody. Awesome.
Thank you.
So yes, covering windows with a shade is important. Just this morning, the sun was peeking through my window, and so I had to cover it with a shade. So that is good. Making sure it's closed to avoid any outdoor noise. Yes, putting things that are very colorful or crayons or things that students may want, like supplies, having those everywhere can kind of be distracting. So making sure those are put away, maybe in a drawer with a label so that they can still find those materials when they're needed, but having those out of their sight so that it's not distracting throughout the class period is good.
We have a question from Coach Thornton. He asked, what do I do for one? Sorry, what would I do for one? Sorry, the chat's moving up.
No, that's not a question. It was a statement. It was just
okay.
a statement. I was just saying what I'll do for one kid, I'll do for the whole classroom.
Gotcha.
And that's a great idea. Like a lot of this video or a lot of this presentation talked about, like some of these things are particularly helpful for students on the autism spectrum, but they can benefit all students. So having these things available for all students. So then you're right, you're not separating that student, you're not alienating them, but you're then helping all students in the classroom. Having that structured daily routine. Especially, I think having structure first thing in the day is important. In my classroom, we always kind of started our day with a morning meeting. Students came in and kind of answered a personal question like about how was your weekend? For Halloween, what were you for Halloween? Things like that so that they can kind of share things about themselves with the class and with you. But it's also expected every day they came in and they knew what to expect and knew what to do first thing in the day. And again, we taught at a middle school. I know morning meeting is pretty common in elementary schools, but it can be used in any at any age level. those light covers to dim the light down, as long as that's okay with your fire marshal, those are very helpful. I know we sometimes, in some of the school buildings I worked in, those weren't really permitted, but as long as that's okay. Sometimes even just having those that you can take down at the end of the day might be okay.
We have a question from someone asking, do we assume a highly disruptive child is also autistic?
I would never assume that. Lots of children have similar stressors. I mean, school can be overwhelming for all students, so I would never assume that they're also autistic. But like we mentioned, like a lot of these supports can also be put in place to help those students as well. So they're particularly helpful for students on the spectrum, but they can be helpful for all students in the classroom. So making posters, keeping the classroom neat and organized is important. Headphones, lots of these suggestions are great. Having something so that like seating, so having distractions from students moving from classroom to classroom, sometimes allowing students to if they're very distracted by other people in the hallway, allowing them to transition a few minutes early or a few minutes late can be helpful. If there's students just sitting in the classroom while other things are going on in the hallways, kind of seating them away from the door so that that's not distracting to them, the things that are going on in the hallway. Having headphones available. Good. The chat's moving pretty quickly. Thank you for all of these. These are great supports that can help our students on the spectrum, or really any student in the classroom. I really like this one, providing a visual of de-escalating strategies for those in need. So having those visuals for like their other supports in place for them is helpful. The zones of self-regulation is awesome to have. We always had like posters that supported that throughout my classroom. We've had like inside out characters that we used that incorporated with the zones of regulation. So kind of finding things that students are interested in. A calming corner. Yes. Thank you for all of these suggestions.
Really, really good suggestions in the chat. I advise if you can, I will keep this link open for a little bit, even during the lunch break, if people want to go back through the chat and kind of write some of these ideas down for your classroom, or if you know how to save the chat with some of these tips and tools that you can use in your classroom as well.
Definitely. All right. So I think we only have about 4 minutes. Typically I go through this case study, but that might take a little longer. And the video I have is about 5 minutes. So if you guys want to just go ahead and keep sharing in the chat, if you have any questions, I'll stick around for about 4 more minutes. I did want to give a shout out to the Center on Secondary Education for Students with Autism Spectrum Disorder and the Organization for Autism Research. Those are both out of the University of North Carolina. A lot of the videos that you saw today and a lot of the information was pulled from some of their professional development materials. So just wanted to make sure they were given a shout out. And again, if you have any other questions, here is my email. So again, I'll stick around for the next 3 minutes or so before your lunch break. But if you have any specific questions, feel free to go ahead and email me at martin.4388@osu.edu. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We really appreciate your time as always and the information. Thank you for your willingness to share the slide as well.